Welcome to Talking Feds, a roundtable that brings together prominent former federal officials and special guests for a dynamic discussion of the most important political and legal topics of the day. I'm Harry Littman. Congress returned to Capitol Hill last Tuesday and brought the Jeffrey Epstein scandal with them. Victims rallied on the steps of Congress and made a forceful push for real transparency, while Donald Trump and his cronies seemed more reluctant than ever to play an open hand. Elsewhere, Trump faced a battery of key legal defeats. An especially eloquent and incisive decision came from Judge Charles Breyer in California, who ruled that the administration had broken the law by having troops in Los Angeles conduct civil law enforcement. The ruling may prove a game changer for Trump's plans to flood other Democratic-led cities with federalized troops. Plus, a dismal jobs report followed quickly on a ruling that found most of Trump's tariffs blatantly illegal. It was a double whammy for the president's agenda and one that revealed the risks of his economic recklessness. To try to assess the risks to the Trump agenda of Epstein's return to the headlines, the decisive legal setbacks around the country, and a weakening job market, I'm excited to welcome back to Talking Feds two of the most knowledgeable political commentators in the country. And they are Aaron Blake. Aaron joined CNN earlier this summer as a senior political reporter after more than a decade as one of the Washington Post mainstays. Prior to the Post, Aaron reported for The Hill and for his hometown paper, the Minneapolis Star-Tribune. Aaron, congratulations on your move, and thanks for joining Talking Feds again.
Hey, Harry, thanks for having me back.
And Senator Heidi Heitkamp. Senator Heitkamp is the director of the University of Chicago's Institute of Politics. She was the first female senator elected from North Dakota, where she served from 2013 to 2019. Before that, she served 8 years as North Dakota's Attorney General. Great to see you again, Senator Heitkamp.
It's great to see you, Harry. And Aaron, wow, I feel really privileged to be with you today. I read your stuff, and it's so important.
Heavy upper Midwest presence on the podcast today, which is never a bad thing.
Oh, yeah, except I have the accent and you don't.
You reminded me of many of my relatives, Senator. I will say that.
Well, if you're reading Aaron regularly, you're taking about an hour a day because he's been really plowing through scoop after scoop since joining CNN. I thought we could start with Jeffrey Epstein, whose return to the news with Congress's return from recess has been a little bit hard to read. Before the recess, it seemed like the momentum for disclosure of the files was really building, and none of the White House's efforts to blunt them or change the subject seemed to be working. Now, with Congress's return, it feels as if some of the air maybe has leaked out of the tires. What happened, and where do you think things stand?
I think that summary is accurate. You know, there was more than a month between when the House recessed early in the midst of all this and when they came back. And keeping a story going for any period of time is especially difficult in the Trump era, I would say. You know, there's constantly a new headline every day and a new controversy. But I think this was always something that was going to be difficult to make go away in that way, for a few reasons. One of the biggest reasons is that the resistance to not disclosing this stuff is largely coming from the right. I mean, these are conservative influencers who have been talking about this for many years. Some of them are now in the administration, like Dan Bongino, who really seem to have kind of a true believer mentality towards this that makes it something that's not just easily moved on from. You know, they'll have these questions. How strongly they ask them is going to be a question. So what we saw this week was the House came back into session. The discharge petition that's being pushed by Congressman Thomas Massie of Kentucky, a Republican, and Democratic Congressman Ro Khanna of California became official, and that gave us a sense right away of how kind of passionate this effort would be. We saw a number of Republicans sign on to that, and so I think that kind of reignited this whole thing and meant that it wasn't going away. And so we don't know how this is going to play out, but clearly the pressure that has been brought to bear on the administration has registered. They've taken a number of very symbolic steps, which I think we can get into to try and get past this, but that at least suggests that they understand that this is not something that can just be ignored.
And I have to say, I think that they've made serious public relations mistakes. Number one, the whole Maxwell interview, which I think ignited fury among the victims and made them much more strident about coming forward, about basically saying, we're going to risk a whole lot of our privacy. We're going to risk re-traumatization because you did something with her that should never have happened. You moved her to Club Fed. You somehow gave her a higher status, like she's the victim here. I think this whole idea of this could get swept under the rug once the victims have reemerged in a very powerful message on Capitol Hill. This is not going to go away. This is going to have to be dealt with. And it just begs the question, because the public understands one thing. What are you hiding? What are you afraid of? You're trying to protect, the innocent. Who's the innocent here that could possibly be in this file that you would need protecting? And it has all the makings of, I don't mean to be saying this disparagingly, but a People magazine front cover, which is it's accessible, it's understandable to the public. We aren't talking about complicated economic issues like tariffs. We're talking about human decency and what could happen to any young girl in America when rich and powerful people decide that they are in ownership as opposed to in a position of protecting children.
And all that's true. And yet at least the vehicle that seems to be now presented, the discharge petition, it's kind of touch and go, right? Whether it will pass. So both of you seem to think this will continue to have legs. That's certainly how it was before the recess, especially as the victims came to the fore. But here they are now. In the past week, there was the news conference backing the congressional push for full transparency. But it seems to be the case that at least many of the people who were ready to push for it before have been backed off by the White House. Yeah, what's been going on sort of behind the scenes, and how has the White House been able to dampen the political push for release and transparency?
I think it's worth getting a little bit into the process of the discharge petition, which people might have heard about every once in a while. And the kind of conventional wisdom is these things rarely ever work. Members of the majority party don't want to sign on to this method, which basically requires 218 members, a majority of the entire House, to force a vote on something. They're reluctant to do that. I think in this case, and the thing about a discharge petition is a lot of times it will get support from some majority members, but getting to the point where you get to 218 is a very difficult thing, because just as with any other vote, being that decisive person to force leadership's hand or to vote against your party on a key piece of legislation is a lot more difficult than casting a protest vote that doesn't actually matter. And so what we've seen 4 House Republicans as of Friday afternoon who have joined with this. That brings the discharge petition basically 2 votes away. There needs to be 2 more House Republicans who would sign on to this. But there's also an interesting dynamic here, which I think is going to be really fascinating the next couple of weeks, which is in the next 2 weeks, there are a couple of special elections in Democratic heavy districts. Those are going to be Democrats winning those seats in all likelihood, and that could ratchet this up from 216 to 217 to 218, the necessary amount. Now, the question at that point is, do some of these Republicans get cold feet about being number 218 to make this happen? And I think this last week suggests that's a very strong possibility, because as you mentioned, some of these kind of Epstein files true believers who suggested they might support this discharge petition have backed off that this week and basically suggested that they think the House Oversight Committee's process is sufficient. So we'll have to see how that pans out, but it is very close to getting to that 218 mark that could really force the leadership's hand.
I think there also is this sense, and having been a member, you don't want to be the last one in. But you also don't want to be somebody who's accused of changing your mind or being a hypocrite. And so they've taken this position, as Aaron says, where it doesn't achieve the intended consequence, but they can then go back to their districts. They can basically feel like they're doing something without having it be meaningful. Now, if there isn't something more than releasing documents that we've already seen, I think it's going to be hard for those 4 people to change their mind. And the challenge that you have in all of this is there is other ways to get at what you need to get at. And as the victim said, they'll come up with their own list of perpetrators. They'll come up with their own client list. And so they aren't going away. These victims are not going to go away. The more of them who stand together, the more you're going to see. The level of victimization that they're alleging is so dramatic. I just think that the fact that you had that public airing on the Capitol grounds this week will really drive a lot of messages back home as people go back home. Even in a state like North Dakota, people are calling on Julie Fedorchak, who is our sole congressperson, to sign the discharge petition. There's going to be a lot of pressure on members the other way as well. And I think that the speaker has only given them a fig leaf. He has not given them any level of protection against that level of criticism that could come.
So what is Johnson's play here? He says, oh, we've got another way of doing it, right? As opposed to just trying to bury it. As the senator says, the documents that have come out now are nothing new. Let's say the discharge petition doesn't quite make it and a few people withdraw. Are the victims now, whereas before it was a Massey and maybe a couple members, are the victims now driving this issue?
I think that's one leverage point. I think another leverage point is the conservative influencer class who, has been very split over this issue. There have been a number of them who have been pressing forward with raising questions and even raising concerns about what the administration does, while there are others who have kind of towed the party line and not wanted to make Donald Trump look bad. So there are just a number of different kind of leverage points here. The discharge petition is one of them. The victims is certainly a major one. We've seen them come forward in a way that we haven't before. I think really early on, one of the most significant things we saw with them was they not only pushed for more disclosure, they basically said, hey, all these influencers who have been talking for all this time about a government cover-up, like, look at what's happening now. Like, this looks a whole lot like a cover-up. And they used that word repeatedly. And so I think at some point, whether it's the discharge petition or anything else, it's a kind of a political strategy question for the administration and for House Republicans, which is, how much do you want to draw this out if the end result is going to be the same? How much do you want this to be painful to get to the point that you might ultimately have to arrive at anyways? And I think right now, the Republican Party takes their marching orders from Trump. And if Trump says, you guys need to kind of hold the line and we need to keep this, as part of the regular order, they're abiding by that. But I think this, unlike pretty much any other issue, is really testing their ability to be able to do that.
This is drip, drip, drip. And in the background is a potential release of documents from the litigation that happened in the Virgin Islands. There's tons of documents there. There's the subpoena that's been presented to the estate. And so there's a whole lot of moving parts here. And the more they call it a hoax, the more they talk about protecting victims, when the victims are speaking out saying, you're not protecting us, the more it just looks like a cover-up. And, they didn't rip off the Band-Aid soon enough. And now they've caught the whirlwind. They're kind of in a jam right now. And this is not going away. Of all the things that I've seen that have happened with this administration, I think clearly the Epstein stuff has the most amount of legs.
The senator makes a really good point, which is the victim speaking out matters in one specific way. And that is that it completely undercuts the justification that House Speaker Mike Johnson has put forward for not allowing this discharge petition to move forward. The idea that Johnson has put forward is that this discharge petition doesn't protect the victims enough.
Right.
Well, it contains a provision that allows the DOJ to redact materials or even withhold documents to protect those victims and their, health information and their privacy. That's one point. But the other thing is, now we have the victims saying, I want this discharge petition. And so it becomes a lot harder, I think, for Johnson to say this is about that issue when the victims themselves are speaking out and saying they support the discharge petition.
And Harry, I think you need to listen to the administration very closely because they talk about the innocent, protecting the innocent. And I think it's really hard to swallow that anyone who would be in those documents who had an association with Jeffrey Epstein is somehow innocent. These are rich and powerful, typically men. And, a lot of women are watching this saying, yeah, here we go again. It's the same old, that the rich and powerful get protected. The administration's not talking about protecting the victims. They're talking about protecting the innocent.
Yeah. And, you mentioned the sexual politics of this. There have been some prominent Republican women who are kind of dividing. And I do think the men being in lockstep with Trump is a pretty bad look. With the women coming forward, it seems that their, at best, insensitivity is really front and center. The main thing that I take away from both of you is that what had seemed to be a pretty boiling over pot is still pretty damn hot. This isn't going away. From the administration's point of view, then, the normal conventional wisdom is get everything out right away, get it out early. And, after all, we're not anticipating some terrible, lurid criminal revelations about Trump, say, just, his palling around and being a wingman. Is it just a sort of miscalculation on his part and their part that they're so desperate to keep it from coming to light?
It's really difficult to say what their reasoning was for backing off of this. I will say that I wrote a piece a couple months ago, basically looking at the timeline of all of this. And if you look at each of the events in succession from when they were talking about, we're going to do full disclosure, and Bondi talking about how, agreeing that there was a client list on Fox News, all the way to that July statement from the DOJ that said, we're not going to release anything else because that would be irresponsible and we're closing this matter. The point at which they seemed to reverse how they talked about this coincided with when Attorney General Pam Bondi told Donald Trump that he was in the files in some way, shape, or form. This was in May. If you look at the timeline, that coincides clearly. Now, that may be not the reason, but I think that kind of reinforces that there doesn't seem to be kind of a really ready-made explanation for this, besides the idea that Trump just decided that he doesn't want this to happen for whatever reason, because maybe it reflects on people. He keeps talking about how this could impact the innocent. Certainly, he's one person who we know is in some of the files, who would be one of those people. So maybe he identifies with those people, but there's not a whole lot of great explanations for why they suddenly decided to reverse themselves on this.
I don't think they reversed themselves. I don't think they ever anticipated that this would become front row and center. And I think they thought Democrats who, obviously there's Democratic names in these files. I don't think anyone should assume there isn't. And they thought, they're going to protect their own. That's not true. Everybody's saying, look, disclose it. I think he thought it wouldn't get here. And I think he thought he has so much control over the right-wing influencers. He has so much control over his base that it wouldn't get to the point where people wouldn't trust him on this. And he miscalculated.
It certainly is the case that if and when things come out, they have positioned it for maximum impact. Now, if what comes out is, some cavorting, some bad behavior with him, and having gone on and on about this being a Democratic hoax and there's nothing there, et cetera, the impact, I think, will be strongest. Aaron, you wrote this week about what you call Trump's elaborate mirage of transparency on Epstein. Quite a nice turn of phrase. But what did you mean by that exactly, and what makes it a mirage?
If you look at every effort to kind of make this go away over the last couple of months, since that Justice Department statement was made public in July, pretty much everything, the uniting kind of ethos of it is that these are things that kind of sound superficially significant, but haven't proven to be that. So we're talking, of course, about the Maxwell interview, which turned up basically nothing. And she wouldn't even admit to not only her crimes, but even knowledge of Jeffrey Epstein's crimes. So that doesn't help you if you're trying to rip the lid off of something that the person you're interviewing won't even talk about what they did wrong. So that was kind of a predictable thing. What is she actually going to say that's going to add to the record here? The other thing that they did initially was say that we're going to go to court and get these grand jury documents out. We're going to ask these various courts that have handled these cases to put these things out that will add to the record. Well, we found out when they did that not only were those grand jury records very limited, they were basically just secondhand testimony from law enforcement who were summarizing what the witnesses would later say at trial. But it was so limited that that was never going to really tell us anything that we didn't already know. And so we saw two judges, in fact, come forward in their rulings on this, and both used the word diversion, that they felt like the government was creating a diversion here by asking for these things that didn't reveal anything and kind of making that the story. And I think that's kind of the uniting characteristic of all their moves up until the release of documents earlier this week from the House Oversight Committee, which didn't really shed any light. Most of it was old news. They're doing things that look like they're trying to do something, but don't really kind of predictably actually tell us anything about this. And I think that gets at the idea that they're just trying to make this go away in one form or another.
And it also goes to insulting the public. When the grand jury thing happened, my comment was, they've got more records than the grand jury has.
That's
there's
what
nothing
that's what one of the judges said. One of the judges said exactly that. He said, the government has all of these documents. They have so many more documents than we do. And if they want to get those out there, they can.
Yeah. And that it insults the intelligence of the average American, because they aren't buying it. They aren't buying that there isn't something that they're hiding in these records that they refuse to release.
I got to say, it has seemed so ham-handed to me. This is maybe my former prosecutor hat, but one of the two judges you referred to, Aaron, was also a former prosecutor. And he went even more. He basically said the only reason to even release it would be to show the disingenuousness of the administration. Anybody knew who was at DOJ that that's not the mother lode that people were clamoring for. You could just look at the indictment and see and know that when it was always a sort of diversionary tactic. And Senator, you mentioned that interview by the Deputy Attorney General. Of all the things that have happened, that's up there with the worst, because it was so completely divorced from any kind of legitimate law enforcement action. That wasn't in the name of the people, and that was just in the name of Donald Trump.
And Harry, that the reaction to that is she gets moved to minimum security. And so if you're a victim out there and you're seeing that, and you're seeing that somehow she's the one with the relief, and she is as bad an actor as Epstein.
It's a little bit reminiscent of the pardons, right? All right, more is going to be coming here, but what I basically hear is a consensus that not sure exactly what happens with the petition, not sure exactly what happens with Massey, but this issue ain't going away. And the drip, drip, drip that the senator mentioned is not going to be fully turned off.
Yep.
I think so. And we're going to be seeing, depositions of various figures that are going to roll out over the next several months here from the House Oversight Committee. So that's just going to prolong things too.
That's actually an excellent point. And when they've been voted on, it's hard for them to resist. Let's move to a little bit more the legal setting. And the Trump administration took it on the chin at Harvard, the FTC, a number of different places. But I was very struck by the Chuck Breyer opinion in California, calling them out for violation of Posse Comitatus, which I know sounds very legal and a big mouthful. But basically what Breyer was saying is they were sending these guys in to crack heads and do law enforcement, not, as they were saying in court, just to kind of be there in a sort of helpful, supportive fashion. It's one district court opinion. We've seen them not carry the day, but it's a very sort of forceful one and has factual findings behind it. Is it a game changer? Because we know that he wants to be coming to your neighborhood, Senator, and to others. He's talking about the militarization. Does this force them to change their strategy, do you think?
I think it doesn't. I think Donald Trump needs this diversion. He thinks that he's winning in the district. And we can all agree the district is a completely different legal landscape on all of this.
Although they brought a very forceful suit against him as well this week, right?
Yeah, but I think, you look at the legal underpinnings of what he's doing in the district, it certainly is a lot stronger than coming into the state of Illinois.
Yeah.
And I don't think he's going to stop, because if one district court opinion would stop bad behavior from this administration, we could make a list of bad behaviors that would have been stopped. And so where we are right now, I think he's hit the pause button I think he's trying to figure out how he can best strong arm it and act under color of law under this opinion. If he decides that that's just too onerous of a kind of mental challenge, I predict he's still going to bring in and try to nationalize the Guard to come to the city of Chicago.
What's really striking about this instance is we should emphasize that Los Angeles and Chicago are not analogous, just like Chicago and DC aren't analogous. So in Los Angeles, this was, of course, about bringing in the troops when there were protests over these ICE raids that were taking place. So this wasn't like a broad, we're going to, have these troops take care of crime. It was a focused event where there wasn't as much violence as the administration suggested there was, but we have seen the National Guard called in before when we've had riots and things like that, when there's a very focused instance of a disruption. That's something that we've seen in the course of American history. Chicago is different because this is much of a broader law enforcement thing. And so the thing that really strikes me about Judge Breyer's opinion, I almost said Justice Breyer, I'm sure everybody does that, but Judge Breyer's opinion was the administration and Trump, for all their talk about how if they didn't send in the troops, Los Angeles would be gone right now. It would be completely decimated. This is a claim that bears no resemblance to reality, based upon what my colleagues observed on the ground there. But the idea was that they were cracking down on this and really basically serving law enforcement functions. Well, they weren't really doing a whole lot of that. The things they were doing were very ancillary next to what the police were doing and other officials were doing. But in Breyer's opinion, they were too much law enforcement to be legal. And so what that means for Chicago is if you want to bring these troops in to do anything amounting to true law enforcement, that's going to be very difficult. Whether Breyer's opinion is upheld or not, the fact that he took these very limited actions like setting up roadblocks and things like that and said those were beyond the pale, I think says something pretty bad about how much an effort like this could pass muster in Chicago. And by the way, I would add, it's been really interesting to see Vice President Vance and Trump talk about this in the last couple of days because they don't sound as keen on doing this as they did before, whether we can read too much into that.
Yeah, that was my sense as well. I mean, I don't know whether they've been a little bit deterred by the opinion. And I just want to say to you, Aaron, I think it's true that the Breyer opinion leaves them room to do this other stuff. But it's certainly been my sense there's been this real disconnect between what they've said in court, and we're just here to conform to Posse Comitatus, and this is what Breyer wrote. The record is replete with evidence that the troops on the ground executed domestic laws. And if you listen to his rhetoric, it sure sounds like they're going to go in and clean up this hellhole, really just a sort of takeover and an indefinite one.
I think it's really important we differentiate between the National Guard, which he nationalized, the California National Guard, and active military, which he also engaged in California. And so clearly the active military, whether it's Marines on the ground, that is very problematic under Posse Comitatus. Now, National Guard, I ran a law enforcement agency when I was the Attorney General. We used National Guard in very ancillary kinds of roles in drug enforcement. They helped us with evidence. They helped us with clerical work. They helped us, do analysis on, what drugs moving one way or the other. So it's not unusual for that relationship, these states to have a relationship of assistance to law enforcement, but not do law enforcement work. Now, Harry, my question to you is, let's assume that they do overstep. We've got this opinion that they're engaged and involved in arrests. What's the legal consequences of that if they decide that the National Guard in any state has overstepped their bounds? And so
that's a great question.
That's a whole other issue. What's the consequences? We're seeing that with tariffs. Are they going to have to refund the money of tariffs under the, imposed under the emergency clause? And so there's real risk here. When you have somebody who's not trying to solve a problem, they're just trying to have showmanship and not leadership on real American problems. There are consequences when you do it wrong.
You're, exactly right. And Breyer did something else in his opinion. It's not simply that he found that Posse Comitatus was violated, but he found an intent to do it from the top down, from Heitkamp basically a scheme to break the law, and it is a criminal law. I have another very quick war story, Senator. I also worked on a Posse Comitatus in the Oklahoma City case. We had to call on the military to try to find a backpack that Nichols had abandoned in the desert, and there could have been such kind of mines there and the like. You needed military specialty. That's the sort of thing you use if you want to do, as you said, something like that. But these guys, they're the new cops in town, and that's, I think, whom Trump wants them to be. So what I liked especially about Breyer's opinion is that it made a very clean distinction. It said, look, I'm not enjoining you from doing these ancillary help things that Posse Comitatus lets you do, but what I'm not letting you do is exactly what I think, the Trump administration wants to do, which is make it look like the feds have, occupied the nation's capital. As part of this possibly declining enthusiasm, they're now talking about going into Louisiana and sent to New Orleans instead of Chicago. Do you see that as in the cards? And will there be a wave of red cities saying, "Oh yeah, that's great. Just come on in and take over, Mr. President"?
Well, I don't think New Orleans is a red city, but Trump has something in Louisiana that he doesn't have in Illinois. He has a sympathetic governor. And the governors are, in fact, the commanders in chief of their National Guard. And so deployment of National Guard in a limited capacity may, in fact, have greater legal underpinnings than what you have in a state like Illinois, where the governor clearly is not going to let him nationalize the National Guard without a fight.
Yeah, and of course, this was part of the problem in Los Angeles because you had Governor Gavin Newsom who fought against this and basically said, we don't want them here, we don't need this. Donald Trump has been talking for many, many years about putting troops on U.S. soil in one form or another. We had the clashes with top military leaders and defense leaders, back in the summer of 2020 when Trump wanted to use the troops to crack skulls, in response to the George Floyd protests. There are a number of kind of scenes like that where he seemed to want to put troops on U.S. soil for one reason or other. And I think that's what kind of joins all of these efforts right now. He almost seems to be looking for a way to make this predetermined, his desire to make that happen in one form or another. And if Chicago isn't going to be a good case for that, these red states where the governor is going to maybe sign off on that gives him a better legal basis for doing that. And so I think it gives him an opportunity, if it is a climb down from Chicago, to maybe say, well, look, I'm doing it here at least where they actually want it. Maybe eventually he'll say, look at how much this helped. Wouldn't you want this elsewhere or something like that? Maybe that's kind of the thought process there.
The thing that I would add here is that how is this sustainable? When people tweak me and say, you Democrats don't care about law and order, I said, well, I spent a lot of my life worried about law and order and working with law enforcement agencies, so I'm not going to take a backseat there. But I'm just saying it doesn't work. What he's doing is not sustainable. There are other strategies and methods working collaboratively with law enforcement across the board that would work a lot better. And so that's getting lost in the mix because this is about flexing muscle and not fixing problems.
I think that's exactly right. And also, relatedly, what is the end game here? I don't think it's an incidental detail, Aaron, that in the comparisons you raised, like after the Rodney King verdict in the 90s or after the Martin Luther King assassination, the local forces were really overrun and said, please come for a couple days and kind of right the ship here. Whereas here, the suit by Newsom, and as I mentioned just this week, D.C. came in and is now sued and said, we don't want you here. This is just grandstanding. And as best I can tell, he wants to have a permanent presence in DC, possibly the same in California. He was triumphant that they got to, keep some of the troops in there, really not doing much of anything. But given the need to show something for this kind of invasion, when does it end exactly? At what point, if he's able to bring them in, does he say, okay, that's enough and take them out? Is it 2 weeks in Chicago, then, this sort of roving force all over the country? And if not, are we looking at a sort of permanent federalization of troops in Northeast, West, and South?
I think the fear among Democrats right now is that The real purpose here is to kind of create the normalization of this, where you call in the troops for a whole host of purposes. You want to kind of make people shrug it off and say, oh, that, they've done that before. This has been done before. And we even had California Governor Gavin Newsom, J.B. Pritzker, the governor of Illinois, recently suggesting that, this is something that could ultimately be used for electoral intimidation, comes 2026 or 2028, and Trump says, well, I'm really concerned about this or that happening at the ballot box in Chicago. I'm going to call in the troops to make sure it doesn't happen. And then those troops being used for some form of intimidation. This is the theory that they're putting forward. I'm not saying whether it's accurate or not, but that's the fear when it comes to normalizing this kind of thing that hasn't been, the things that Trump is doing here are extraordinary no matter how you slice it. And so that's the fear that they have.
Yeah, I think that's always it too, that sort of knight's move from once there's an inroad to use emergency powers. And we know that they're doing things to try to already meddle in the elections. Our Substack today in Talking Feds is just about this, how these arguments could be setting up for real inroads in elections and possible legal chicanery. Now it's time for our sidebar feature, which presents brief accounts of important concepts in the current legal landscape, as read by a prominent person from another field. Today's sidebar topic is the case of Humphrey's executor, a landmark Supreme Court decision that continues to shape the balance of power between the executive branch and independent agencies, but that the Supreme Court has made clear may be on the chopping block. To explain the decision, I'm really pleased to welcome Andrea Savage. Andrea Savage is an acclaimed actress, comedian, and writer. She starred in hit comedies like Veep and Curb Your Enthusiasm, and she created and led the fan favorite series, I'm Sorry. On film, you've seen her in Step Brothers and Look Both Ways. And more recently, she appeared alongside Sylvester Stallone in Tulsa King. I give you Andrea Savage on Humphrey's executor.
Can the president fire without cause protected officials of administrative offices? President Franklin Delano Roosevelt asked this exact question in so many words by firing William Humphrey from the Federal Trade Commission in 1925. FDR had asked Humphrey to resign twice. This was because the Coolidge-appointed official was not very supportive of the New Deal. Finally, FDR fired Humphrey for his politics. Unfortunately for FDR, Congress explicitly created the FTC as an administrative body that stands somewhat independent from the president. Congress required any firing of FTC officials to be the result of inefficiency, neglect of duty, or malfeasance in office. FDR had fired Humphrey solely on political grounds. That said, his lawyers argued that FTC officials are units of the executive department. Therefore, they should serve solely at the pleasure of the president. The case reached the Supreme Court in 1935 after Humphrey's death. In his lieu, the executor of Humphrey's estate pursued the case to receive his back pay. Hence the name of the case, Humphrey's Executor v. United States. The court found that Humphrey's firing on policy ground was illegal. While the president can fire officers of the executive branch at will, the FTC is unique as a quasi-legislative, quasi-judicial, independent body. Nearly a century later, President Trump has attempted to overturn the case with his firings of Kathy Harris at Merit Systems Protection Board and Gwen Wilcox at the National Labor Relations Board. Hopefully, the court sticks to its guns and upholds Humphrey's executor. For Talking Feds, I'm Andrea Savage.
Thank you very much, Andrea Savage. Savage is currently developing and headlining Perf, a new comedy for Fox. All right, it is now time for a spirited debate brought to you by our sponsor, Total Wine and More. Each episode, you'll be hearing an expert talk about the pros and cons of a particular issue in the world of wine, spirit, and beverages.
Thank you, Harry. today's spirited debate comes with a bit of a twist as we look to the very top of the wine bottle and ask which is better, cork or screw top? At face value, people think screw top equals cheap wine, which, as it turns out, isn't exactly true. The reason for screw tops is to ensure the wine tastes as the winemaker intended. Cork, which has been used to seal wine bottles for over 100 years, is a proven way to age wine effectively by allowing minute amounts of air to come in contact with the wine. This slowly develops a softer texture and enhances flavor. Now cork, traditional as it is, has a downside called TCA, which causes something called cork taint. Now cork taint, while affecting a very small percentage of wines, can be a big disappointment, causing a musty aroma similar to the smell of wet cardboard and contaminating a great bottle of wine. We turn back again to screw caps, which are cork taint proof, of course, not to mention much easier to open, especially in a kitchen surrounded by witnesses. How the aging process affects wines with a screw cap is yet to be known, as wineries continue to test. Whether it's a cork or screw top, at Total Wine & More, our guides will help you find the perfect wine to match your tastes. After all, it's not just about what's on top of the bottle, it's what's inside that counts.
Thanks to our friends at Total Wine & More for today's A Spirited Debate. Okay, let's move to I think what was the other biggest loss for them this week. There was the striking down of the tariffs, which is huge in and of itself. The federal appeals court ruled 7-4 that they've got to be reversed, whatever that would mean. But that's combined today, just this morning, a really bad, ugly set of job figures. We added just 22,000 jobs last month. The unemployment rate rose to 4.3%. Is Trump now presiding over an economy in crisis? And what's he able to say about his normal championing of everything he's doing, given this pretty glum report?
Well, I mean, this is one snapshot in time. And you think about this. Here's some other metrics that are happening in the real world. Number one, we have record consumer debt and growing default rates on credit cards. We have record defaults on car loans. So people aren't paying their car loans. We have growing costs at the grocery store. Inflation ticking upwards. Now, it wasn't anywhere near what it was at the big peak, but these prices have not come down and tariffs have driven. Let's take a can of coffee. Anyone who's recently bought a can of Folgers knows that price has doubled pretty much since Trump took over. And that's tariff driven. We have unemployment numbers ticking up, more and more layoffs, uncertainty in the consuming public about AI and about their economic condition, less security about their job. And this is driving consumer sentiment at all-time low. And these employment numbers are the lowest in a long, long time. And you can argue, why don't you see higher rates of unemployment? We can, get into that as a matter of economics. And so what I'm saying, Harry, is that these numbers, taken in and of themselves, are not necessarily reflective. But that's not what he should be worrying about. He should be worrying about the fact that middle class, his base, middle class and working class families are not keeping pace, and their economic condition is getting less and less certain. You can talk about Epstein, you can talk about all this litigation, but at the end of the day, it really is about the economy. And right now, no matter what he says, the more he says the economy is the best in the history of the world, that's not what people are feeling. And you add to this a real problem, and Aaron can speak to this. They've got a huge problem looming with triggering off of the Obamacare subsidies that are going to ratchet up healthcare costs dramatically, especially in some of the red states that did not expand Medicaid. And this is going to hit at the same time the Medicaid changes are going to hit. So if you look on the horizon, you might think that he's trying to divert from Epstein. I think he's trying to divert from a really horrible set of circumstances in this economy.
This is the thing he's trying to change the subject from. Okay, let's stick with the tariffs. I mean, they've now appealed to the Supreme Court, saying that the appeals court decision basically could create economic catastrophe. Quite a lot of pressure.
It's not his action that's the catastrophe. It's the court.
Will the court save his bacon here, and can it? And, if tariffs are out the window, really are, the notion of trying to unwind that spool seems really daunting.
I'm fascinated by this argument that they're making in court that the courts can't rule against these tariffs because it would be, so
Too big to fail, almost.
too
right.
big to fail. They're saying that the tariffs are too big to fail. That's a great way to put it. But also, if that's the case, why wouldn't you go to Congress to get them to sign off on these things to make sure that that didn't ultimately happen? You're basically acknowledging that you have decided to kind of play a form of Russian roulette with the economy by doing this unilaterally. And so I think that's them throwing arguments at the wall in court. But what I think is significant here, and I'm not an economist, so I'm not going to pretend to know what this new jobs report means or any of the various factors that Senator Heitkamp mentioned. I'm not smart enough to figure that out. Clearly, there are plenty of pretty troubling signs, and the jobs report is very high on that list right now. And I think the danger for Trump right now, and I just wrote about this, is he has done so many things that are unpopular, that have been in the service of giving himself more power. And people don't like them. They don't like his methods, but I don't think they care enough to make a big deal out of it. So there hasn't been this kind of broad scale public backlash against, what he did with deportations or the Doge cuts or things like that. They didn't have kind of a direct impact on people. I think the economy is obviously different from a lot of that, in that if this does go south, I think this really undercuts the entire enterprise of the Trump presidency and his efforts to get himself more power, because that is something that is very easy for people to attach to this very specific and very drastic policy that he put forward several months ago and has kind of been going back and forth on ever since then. He took ownership of a very still kind of recovering economy that was tenuous, and we still had significant inflation. And he did something that kind of gave himself some ownership of that in a way that I think a normal president would have said, maybe we should leave this alone for now and maybe try to do that a little bit later. And I think that's, whether or not the tariffs are the ultimate undoing, or if there is an undoing of the economy, that was a political calculus that I think could ultimately come back to bite him in a lot of ways.
The other thing I will say about tariffs, and this is probably in the weeds, he used a very unique statute to impose very dramatic tariffs. He has emergency powers that no one would disagree with 232 tariffs, with 301 tariffs, but they require a more methodical process. And he took a shortcut, and that shortcut bit him in the butt. And people say, it's just you liberals complaining about tariffs. I said, this litigation was brought by a very, very conservative group who does not believe that this president or any president should have the ability to impose unilateral taxes on the American people. And so how much damage those tariffs did to the economy, I think it is a whole host of issues of not paying attention to middle-class issues, not paying attention to the bread and butter, the macaroni and cheese issues that get presidents elected or unelected. And he's walking a tightrope here. That's why he needs diversion into law and order, into what's happening at the border, into, the whole thing that he did in the Gulf with Venezuelan so-called cartels. So all of this stuff, I think his people are smart enough to know that the economic smoke signals are not good, and they aren't going to get better unless something happens dramatically. And on top of that, if you look at the indices of American manufacturing, we're going down in manufacturing, not up in manufacturing. So his big promise of bringing back American manufacturing jobs, that's not being delivered on. And how much patience does the American public have?
And I just want to underscore the point that Aaron made, that what he's done here is, as in so many other areas, is simply supplant Congress's role. But why not try to have moved through them? And that's
Harry, he couldn't get him passed.
Yeah,
that's why he doesn't go there. There's
right.
no way. He lost the emergency measure. He lost Republicans on a vote on whether the fentanyl was an emergency in Canada. He would never get him passed. That's why he didn't go to Congress. And he loves tariffs.
Here's a question for you, Senator Heitkamp, if I could. If you stripped President Trump away from this era of our politics, and you put a vote on something like Trump tariff on the floor in the Senate when you served a decade ago, like say 2014, 2015, would more Democrats vote for those tariffs, or would more Republicans vote for those tariffs?
Oh, that's an excellent question, because Democrats have a reputation well earned for being protectionist and actually liking tariffs and liking that kind of, put up the barriers and protect American jobs and American workers. And, the party of free trade, which has always been the Republican Party, is no longer the party of free trade. So I would tell you that take a look at the vote on TPA, Trade Promotion Authority. It was just a few brave Democrats like me who actually voted for it. And that has completely flipped. But what I will tell you, in the first Trump administration, was when he was imposing 232s and 301s, I was one of the leaders trying to claw back that emergency authority from the president. No one ever anticipated that a president would do this. And it's, again, that norm breaking that this president engages in, but he just took this one too far. As we say in the law, he didn't turn square corners. He tried to take a shortcut, and the shortcut bit him in the proverbial you-know-where.
What about all this saber rattling with the Fed moving to fire Lisa Cook? He's been very pugnacious about Powell. How does that fit in here? And how can he possibly think that doesn't promote lack of confidence in what he's doing in the economy?
I've got kind of three general theories on this. One is that he just kind of wants to be in control of everything. I mean, we see that through any number of issues. And so the idea that he can't be in control of the Federal Reserve in one way or another by, maybe appointing people to it or kind of influencing them, I think that's frustrating for him, because he is somebody who wants to have all this power and believes that that's part of his mandate, or at least talks like he believes that that's the case. The second thing is that regardless of whether he wants to fire Jerome Powell, the idea is that you're applying pressure on the Fed to give you what you want. So maybe Jerome Powell doesn't give him the rate cuts the way he does want them, but he gives in to some degree, or maybe he reduces the rates, which, by the way, I think after the new jobs report, a rate cut is now likely to be pretty significant. So maybe Trump is going to back off a little bit on that. But the third thing is, and I think we could start to see this if the economy really does go bad, is this gives him something to blame. And we saw him say that early on Friday. This was the first thing that he said about this bad jobs report, was that Jerome Powell was too slow in cutting rates, and that's why this happened. I don't know many economists that necessarily agree with that, but Donald Trump has had a lot of success over the years in kind of having a very oversimplified scapegoat for the things that go wrong. And I think that's how this is going to ultimately be used for him.
Yeah. The other thing is that he rattled the markets when he threatened Jerome Powell. He's watching to see how are the markets responding if he threatens other governor's status. And so that you haven't seen that kind of interference basically shake the markets where a all-out assault on the chairman did. And so I think the other thing that the Fed has to think about, Aaron, is we've got these really bad job numbers, even adjusted job numbers. I mean, really bad, but yet you don't have unemployment at a really high rate. And so this is the anomaly. You have tariffs, but you haven't seen inflationary response. And so the Fed is in a really interesting position right now. But I would challenge anyone to say he has messed up fiscal policy so bad to the point that we may, in fact, be in a bond crisis in the next 2 years. He's messed up fiscal policy so bad. That's why we want to give him monetary policy unilaterally. I mean, I think Jerome Powell understands who he's dealing with. I think he is a very confident person. He's not going to be bullied into anything. And I think the Fed governors aren't going to be bullied into anything. But they do see a softening of this economy. But interest rates are not necessarily the fix. Everybody thinks that this is some magic wand that you wave and somehow it's going to fix the economy. We've got fundamental principles that are very difficult right now, driven by tariffs, driven by increased costs of inputs. And we have a worker shortage and a slowdown driven by immigration policies. And so this is so much more complicated than just but I agree with you, Aaron. This is all about who you're going to blame. I guess there's no one left to fire over there at the Bureau of Labor Statistics. You got an even worse report, so we got to find another scapegoat.
It's really interesting. They didn't fall back on that argument on Friday when the jobs report came out. They weren't saying the data were rigged again. They were more like, oh, well, give it some time and Jerome Powell and things like that. So I don't know. Interesting.
Yeah, I was going to say, when you look at these numbers, one thing that is good about this, that I think we should all take a sigh of relief, no one's rigging these numbers over at the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And I think the concern was that we won't be able to trust these numbers. I think that's been alleviated a little bit by this jobs report.
Geez, that's a low bar to clear, but it's true after what happened before. All right, more to come on all of these, but we're out of time. We just have a minute for our final feature of 5 words or fewer, where we take a question from a viewer and we each have to answer in 5 words or fewer. Today, the question is, Trump wants to rebrand the Department of the Defense to Department of War. What department or agency will get renamed next, and to what?
I would say the Department of Energy is not really all about energy, so maybe you could change it to like the Department of Giant Nukes or something like that.
Okay.
Much more about nuclear than energy.
The Department of HHS is going to be renamed the Department of Bad Science.
There you go. Run by Mayor Adams. I'm going with the Department of Education to the Department of, who cares? Thank you so much to Aaron and Heidi, and thank you very much, listeners, for tuning in to Talking Feds. If you like what you've heard, please tell a friend to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts or wherever they get their podcasts, and please take a moment to rate and review this episode. You can also subscribe to us on YouTube, where we are posting full episodes and my daily takes on top legal stories. Check us out as well on Substack at harrylitman.substack.com, where I'll be posting 2 or 3 bulletins a week, breaking down the various threats to constitutional norms and the rule of law. And Talking Feds has joined forces with The Contrarian. I'm a founding contributor to this bold new media venture, committed to reviving the diversity of opinion that feels increasingly rare in today's news landscape, where legacy media seems to be tacking toward Trump for business reasons rather than editorial ones. Rest assured, we're still the same scrappy, independent podcast you've come to know and trust, just now linked up with an ambitious project designed for this pivotal moment in our nation's legal and political discourse. Find out more at contrarian.substack.com. Thanks for tuning in. And don't worry, as long as you need answers, the Feds will keep talking. Talking Feds is produced by Luke Cregan and Katie Upshaw. Associate producer, Becca Havian. Sound engineering by Matt McArdle. Rosie Dawn Griffin, David Lieberman, Hamza Mahadrenathan, Emma Maynard, and Hallie Necker are our contributing writers. And production assistance by Akshaj Turbailu and Sebastian Navarro. Thanks very much to Andrea Savage for explaining the critical case of Humphrey's executor. Our music, as ever, is by the amazing Philip Glass. Talking Feds is a production of Delito LLC. I'm Harry Littman. Talk to you later.